Capital controls always presage the undoing of a good monetary system. So I think you just got to get simple real fast. If the government just kind of got out of it, you would see this incredible renewal of private creativity and how to address all these challenges.
So a light touch.
Could you guys join me in welcoming Michael and Brian to the stage?
Thanks, Rod. Appreciate it. We've also gotten a lot of insight on rulemaking and policy making while we're here, not just folding up chairs and helping out that way. But appreciate the opportunity to help moderate this and chat with you, Brian. Now, you've written a book, Free Money, right? Do you want to say a little bit about your book before we get going?
Yeah, absolutely, Mike. So my name is Brian Domitrovic. And with Benton Hauser, I wrote a book called Free Money, Bitcoin and the American Monetary Tradition. It's a history of the American monetary system, 1776 to the present, from the perspective of Bitcoin. And I think, we talk about how futuristic Bitcoin is. It's totally consistent with our past. And that's what this book explores.
Great. So the title of our panel here is Custody as a Resilience, Lessons from Geopolitical Instability. And so we'll just go right into it and I'll ask you, how should lawmakers and their staff evaluate frameworks for digital assets and when considering the regulatory issues?
Yeah, I'm just going to play the same card for every question. I'm going to go to American monetary history, the kind of stuff we talk about in this book. Darn it if I just don't see any role. The federal government did absolutely nothing with respect to custody of U.S. dollars, ensuring that banks were sound and all that stuff until the founding of the Federal Reserve in 1913. We go over quite a bit in the book about the national bank system that was created during the Civil War, prevailed until the 20s, and the free banking system before that. There was really only one thing the government cared about in the 19th, early 20th century, as goes like custody and security of money. They cared about whether or not banks were holding a minimum of federal bonds. Because they wanted to finance their own operation. We're going to audit the banks to make sure they're sound, to make sure they're custodying assets correctly. No, to make sure they own our bonds. And that was the same thing with state bank regulation. So this whole thing about government should be involved with figuring out custody, there's no precedent for that. That's entirely a modern invention. When you don't have a federal government system or a government system at all, then you just see these remarkable private organizations spring up to deal with issues like custody, the clearinghouses in the 19th century. So I think if the government just kind of got out of it, you would see this incredible renewal of private creativity and how to address all these challenges.
So a light touch.
Yeah, I really would kind of get out of the business. I mean, this stuff like deposit insurance and the whole gamut is entirely a novelty of the post-Federal Reserve American monetary history, entirely. So what that also does is it suppresses innovation. So, there were all sorts of wonderful private organizations in the 19th century that made sure that, dollars were housed correctly, that people were good on their deposits, that there wasn't fraud, all sorts of private innovation. And that's a world that opens up to us. Again, if we reclaim the new classical money in Bitcoin and governments take their 19th century role, and I'm just going to make the point we make constantly in this book, how is the economy under that circumstance? It blows away our economic growth rate of today. Probably at triple the economic growth rate. If you want to use GDP as a statistic, probably triple, probably 6% per average as opposed to 2% per average. So nothing but good things.
I'll kind of throw, I don't know if it's a curveball or not, but when you think about the U.S. federal government and the shifts in the administration's perspectives as you change administrations, there's always this risk of you have a Bitcoin-friendly administration that decides a hands-off approach is the right approach, but the next guy comes in and decides to take a heavy-handed approach and, appoints Gary Gensler, head of the SEC. And the reaction can be hard and swift. So you can't really just have no model whatsoever in terms of the frameworks. What would be, in your opinion, a safe model or for that custody framework in terms of being able to protect from what happens after the next election?
I would say taking the issue of custody broadly speaking, and we advocate for this specific reform in the book, I would say the single most important step the federal government could make right now is to revert to classical principles and not tax monetary transactions. Yeah, I mean, Bitcoin right now is taxed at capital gains rate. That is completely unheard of. It's reportable on a federal income tax return every single transaction. That is a completely unhistorical burden on monetary transactions. Private creators of dollars were innumerable in the 19th century. So and we kind of talk about it in competitive terms. I mean, why is the U.S. government kind of fearful of Bitcoin? Can't you compete? You're the dollar. You're the big bad dollar. Go ahead and compete against Bitcoin. You only do that on a fair level playing field if you eliminate the capital gains tax. So I would say, I can't predict if a new Gary Gensler is going to come forth through the next administration, but the one step that can be taken now is to eliminate capital gains tax on all monetary transactions. And there we go.
Well, moving on, then drawing from economic history, where have you seen society succeed or where have they failed in building a financial system that's able to absorb or be resilient to geopolitical shifts and shocks?
I mean, warfare, to speak of the granddaddy of geopolitical shocks, is intimately connected with central banking. I mean, all the European central banks all basically came about in order to be a financing arm of the state in times of warfare. And that's true for the United States. I mean, when the United States set up the Federal Reserve a couple months before the Great War started, the biggest conflagration in human history up to that point. And you look at it, 1869 on, all sorts of central banks were founded in order to finance the theory of war in the 20th century. Bank of France under Napoleon, and you maybe can make the argument too, even for the Bank of England. So the first observation I would make is that there's an intimate connection between the rise of central banking and the wish of governments to kind of end Pax Romana, Pax Americana, and to begin ages of warfare. So I don't see private currency systems encouraging that kind of activity at all. Private currency systems generally are conducive to those long periods like a Pax Americana. So, no, I think the more central banks come to defer to monetary innovation and try to compete with it levelly, I think there's a much greater chance of the lessening of geopolitical vicissitudes.
Great. So bridges that can be built between sound policy and sound custody practice that ensure institutions can remain compliant and resilient in uncertain times.
Yeah, that's what I'd love to hear from everybody in the audience, everyone in the whole universe here. I don't even know. I don't know what the private innovation is to make custody great and to make new currencies a great transaction instrument. I don't even know because, I've grown up in the Federal Reserve of the United States. What the heck do I know? I mean, it's just been this big ceiling on innovation and mental imagination. That's why it's so interesting to be among people who can kind of break through the ceiling, the kind of encrusted bureaucratic traditions that we have in central banking and government regulation of banks, to imagine if, beyond that. I don't know that that's necessarily my métier, but obviously Bitcoin exists and it's really booming. So there are people who are breaking through those incrustations, those barnacles. I am perfectly confident, given American monetary history, that a robust economy like that of the United States, for Pete's sake, greatest in the history of the world, will come up with really great custody arrangements. I mean, who lost money in the 19th century? What, to bank robbers? People talk about busted banknotes, that banks issued dollars because they were allowed to and then just ran off with the money. Yeah, that was 0.2% of all the entire money supply. The Federal Reserve's their aspirational goal is to have money devalued by 2% per annum. I mean, that's about 100-fold over what the broken banknotes were in the 19th century in terms of devaluation of total assets, monetary assets. So I think private creativity is going to get it done.
Great. And Rod told us that he would zap some sats every time we said "imagine if" up on the stage. So good work.
I did it.
So from a policymaking perspective, how do sanctions and capital controls shape the custody challenges in the U.S.?
Yeah, sanctions and capital controls. We talk a lot about this. I'm a historian. I study the history of the monetary system. Man, the United States got really interested in that stuff in the 1960s. Really, just the variety of capital controls. I mean, they were taxing foreign transactions. Importing capital to the United States, they're going to tax it. Gold sales were just to controlled to the max, all sorts of controls stationed in, I don't know about South Korea, but Preston, but stationed in Germany in the 60s, you had to spend your money on base because they feared, there was new regulation, because they feared if you spend it in Dusseldorf or wherever, then the Europeans will have a euro dollar, and that'll be a claim on the American gold stock. And yeah, come on. So capital controls in the great era of their ascendance in the United States in the 1960s presaged one thing and one thing only: ending the gold standard. How'd that turn out? Well, I mean, we give a million ways to demonstrate what it meant to end the gold standard. We had a decade of stagflation. Okay, that's horrible. Look at the Case-Shiller housing price index, absolutely stable. Average price per home in the United States was stable from 1890 to 1965. 1965 since been a straight line up with some up and down, but straight line. And that's just a hedge against the fiat monetary system. That's all it is. Capital controls always presage the undoing of a good monetary system. So if the United States tries to put on capital controls or increase capital controls right now, they're giving up on the dollar, fine. But really what they should try to do is make the dollar competitive with Bitcoin. So capital controls are always a white flag of surrender.
Picking up some libertarian vibes from you. What lessons from American monetary history, I think you've mentioned your history buff, was outlined in your book, Free Money, you think can help us understand the resilience of Bitcoin custody under stress?
So the American economy grew like crazy in the 19th century. Government was very small, so from kind of a libertarian perspective, there was no internal taxation at the federal level from 1817 to 1861, none. No federal taxation on domestic inhabitants of any sort. The only federal tax was the tariff, which was on external, had to be paid by foreigners. State governments were 0.4% of GDP. Local governments might have been 2 or 3% of GDP. So you had very small governmental profile. So the whole 4%, 6% economic growth every year. So you had this incredible pressure on the private economy to make sure that it worked. And it did work. There was 4 to 6% growth every year. It became the greatest economy in the history of the world. So what did they do? Oh man, the stories of how they protected their capital. My favorite book, we quote it a lot. My favorite book, actually, in all of American business history is Andrew Mellon's father's autobiography. Mellon Bank, Andrew Mellon, the great Secretary of the Treasury, predecessor to Scott Bessent, the current occupant, the current incumbent. His father wrote an autobiography in 1888 called The Times of Thomas Mellon. And it's just a remarkable portrait of what it meant to try to do banking business and business in general in the 19th. And he talks about how he started a bank. Thomas Mellon started Mellon Bank in the 1850s. He quit his judgeship, so he quit his government job. And he said, darn it, I'm gonna go into the real world. And he started a bank. And he has these amazing stories. We quote some of them in this book. You should really all read it. It really, literally is my favorite book in American business history. He's a great writer. Andrew Mellon was famous for not saying anything, for being laconic. His father was not that way at all. His father was garrulous. He talked. And he took in all this money. It was mainly working class money in Pittsburgh in the 1860s and 1870s. And he wasn't that big. He was taking working class money. And then the Panic of 1873 happened. And, he had to sweat bullets. And he made sure that he made good, even from his personal fortune, to every Irish widow that came. And this is all true. It's all verified. It's all documented. You can make it up. So this is the kind of custody operation we see in American history. This isn't some kind of made-up thing. No, these are the central institute. How important was Andrew Mellon to the world industrial revolution? Oh, probably the second or third most important person after like Rockefeller. And his father is instilling these custody ideals and values into his son, and we have it on paper. It's the real economic history of this country. It's the real stuff. Is private caretaking for custody of precious assets. So we have all the historical resources.
And I know when we were talking about building out regulatory framework, your response was don't. But if you were to help facilitate or build out the room of policymakers, of minds that are discussing with members of Congress how to build out framework around custody, who do you put in that room?
Okay. Yeah, I remember I once visited Janet Yellen when she was chair of the Fed and I was with John Allison, the BB&T chair, and man, did he excoriate her. And he just said, you are putting such pressure on our small banks with your examiners, and their costs relative to their balance sheets are so high because of your regulation. Listen to advice like that. That's the first thing I would say. We just have to assume that, especially for small institutions, the federal regulatory pressure is simply too high. I mean, Steve Moore just today on his hotline, had Jamie Dimon's famous graph of the nest of federal banking regulatory agencies. And, we all know who Jamie Dimon is. He's the king of world banking. And he's like, I can't figure out the federal banking regulation network. I mean, it just looks like a super, super complicated series of spider webs. Well, you're going to have over-bigness and oversize and squeezing out small players. So when I say you have to rationalize the regulatory framework, yeah, you got to do that big time. And probably the easiest way to do that is with a meat cleaver. I mean, I don't know that kind of separating webs out is going to get it done. I mean, when California had to deal with their property tax problem in 1978, with 2.6% property taxes and skyrocketing assessments, they took a meat cleaver to it. It's now 1%. It's down 60% tomorrow. And it worked. California became the greatest place in the modern economic history because of that in the 1980s, 1990s. So I don't know that there's a way out. I think you just got to get simple real fast. And if that means dropping a lot of traditions and, we're going to have, rely on private regulation, then so be it. I think the priority has to be on getting out.